In the heart of Compton, a city renowned for its vibrant culture and history of resilience, a routine bus ride quickly transforms into a battleground for justice. What begins as a simple act of defiance by the legendary rapper Snoop Dogg turns into a powerful stand against racial prejudice and authority. As the bus jerks to a halt on a busy morning, Snoop finds himself face to face with Michael Henderson, a bus driver whose deep-rooted bias threatens to derail not just the ride, but the very spirit of equality. Tensions rise when Henderson demands that Snoop, a paying passenger, move to the back of the bus. What follows is a charged confrontation, watched by a growing crowd both inside and outside the bus. Passengers, initially hesitant, are forced to decide. Will they remain silent or will they stand up for what's right? The story that unfolds is more than just about a seat on a bus. It is a reflection of the fight for justice, dignity, and the power of standing up to injustice, no matter the cost. The setting and the encounter. The streets of Compton, a place where history, culture, and struggle are deeply ingrained in every corner, bustled with the energy of an early morning commute. The sun had just begun to rise, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks, and the air held the crisp chill that accompanied the dawn of a new day. Amid the hustle of people heading to work, catching buses, and starting their routines, there was one figure who stood out: Snoop Dogg. A towering icon in the world of music and culture, Snoop had become a symbol of calm resilience and effortless cool. But on this particular morning, he would find himself in a situation that demanded more than just the usual persona. As Snoop made his way toward the bus stop, his head held high, sunglasses firmly in place, and a subtle swagger in his step, no one could have guessed that this simple act of commuting would turn into a confrontation that would soon make waves. With a tight grip on his phone, he adjusted his stance, preparing for the short ride that was part of his everyday life. His presence was unmistakable, his iconic style, his demeanor, and the aura that followed him wherever he went. But as he approached the bus, a strange tension hung in the air. The bus door hissed open with a mechanical groan, releasing a puff of warm air from inside. The smell of faintly stale seats and the noise of the engine were familiar to anyone who rode it regularly, but today there was something more charged in the atmosphere. The bus driver, Michael Henderson, sat at the wheel, his eyes narrowing as Snoop stepped onto the vehicle. Henderson's face was set in a hard scowl, his posture stiff with an unspoken frustration. Snoop, ever polite, nodded his head slightly in acknowledgement, dropped his fare into the box, and proceeded toward an empty seat near the front. But Henderson, who had clearly not been prepared for the presence of the famous rapper, was not as forgiving. His eyes flashed with something more than simple impatience. There was a deep sense of authority mixed with an unspoken sense of entitlement. "Hurry it up," Henderson barked as Snoop moved forward, his voice rough and impatient, lacking the warmth one might expect from a public servant tasked with transporting passengers. The tone was abrupt, sharp, cutting through the otherwise calm morning atmosphere. Snoop didn't let it faze him, choosing instead to simply glance up briefly, not allowing the comment to affect his focus. He adjusted his grip on the pole as the bus lurched forward, making his way toward an empty seat near the front. The low hum of the engine filled the bus, but there was something off about the energy inside. Snoop's calmness contrasted sharply with the bus driver's gruffness. It was a familiar scene for anyone who'd ever felt the sting of an authoritative figure who believed they held all the power. The driver, clearly irritated by Snoop's decision to sit up front, called out sharply from his seat, "Not there." His voice echoed down the length of the bus, breaking the subtle hum of the vehicle and drawing the attention of the other passengers. A hush immediately fell over the bus. All eyes turned toward the front as the exchange began. Snoop stopped mid-step, his body frozen for just a moment, before he turned slowly to face Henderson. The air felt heavy with tension, and the passengers began to shift in their seats, unsure of what to make of the situation. A young woman near the window looked down, avoiding eye contact, clutching her child closer to her side. An older man in a suit adjusted his tie nervously, his eyes darting around the bus. For a brief moment, the sound of the bus engine seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the subtle rustling of clothing and whispered murmurs from the passengers. "Excuse me," Snoop said, his voice calm and composed, his expression giving nothing away. "I paid my fare," he continued, his words carrying a quiet but firm defiance. "I'll sit where I please." There was no trace of anger in his tone, just a quiet conviction, as though this was simply a matter of principle. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had followed the rules, paid his fare, and was simply taking his seat. Yet, The driver had decided to challenge him, as if his very presence in the front of the bus was a violation. The atmosphere in the bus seemed to freeze. It was a moment pregnant with potential, the quiet before a storm. The passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable. It was clear that something was happening, something larger than a simple disagreement over where one should sit. Snoop's words hung in the air, reverberating through the cramped space. This wasn't just a challenge of seating, it was a test of authority, of who held the power in this small, confined world. And in that moment, Snoop Dogg wasn't backing down. The bus driver, Michael Henderson, wasn't used to being defied. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing, and with a swift motion, he slammed the brakes, sending the bus lurching forward with a jolt. The sudden stop caused several passengers to grab onto nearby poles and seats to steady themselves. A brief silence followed the violent motion, but it was soon shattered by Henderson's harsh words. "Either you move to the back, or you're off this bus. Your choice." The passengers shifted again, their discomfort growing. Some whispered among themselves, their voices hushed but filled with tension. They didn't want to get involved, didn't want to be part of the drama that was unfolding right before their eyes. But as the minutes stretched on, the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. Everyone was aware of what was at stake, and the balance between passivity and intervention was beginning to tip. Snoop stood firm, his posture unyielding. His eyes never left Henderson's, and his expression remained calm, collected. There was no hint of fear, no hesitation in his voice when he responded again, "I'm not going anywhere." In that moment, the rest of the bus seemed to hold its breath. The power dynamic had shifted. What was once a normal, routine ride was now a moment of profound social tension, and the question on everyone's mind became clear. Who would bend first, the authority figure or the one standing up to it? The stage was set. Snoop's refusal to comply was not just a personal matter. It had become a public declaration of defiance. It wasn't just about sitting in a seat. It was about standing up for his right to be treated equally, without prejudice, without deference to an authority figure who thought they could impose their will simply because they held power. As the passengers remained frozen in place, unsure of what would happen next, the first signs of a crowd gathering outside the bus were becoming visible. The tension inside the bus was thickening with every passing second. The conflict escalates. As Snoop Dogg stood firm, refusing to move from his seat near the front of the bus, the tension in the air grew heavier. The hum of the bus engine seemed to fade away, replaced by the sharp sound of Henderson's voice, which now carried an unmistakable sense of anger and frustration. The bus driver, Michael Henderson, wasn't just annoyed anymore. He was livid. His face had reddened with rising fury, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. This wasn't simply about seating arrangements. This was about control, about power, about someone daring to challenge his authority in front of a bus full of passengers. "You think you're special?" Henderson sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. He stood from behind his driver's seat, towering over the aisle. His uniform stretched tightly across his broad shoulders, and his eyes bore into Snoop with a mix of irritation and contempt. "I make the rules here. If I tell you to move, you move." The words were sharp and bitter, each one intended to assert his dominance over the situation. The passengers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that this wasn't going to be resolved quietly. The young mother who had been clutching her child tightly glanced nervously at Snoop, her eyes flicking between the wrapper and the increasingly volatile bus driver. The older man who had been pretending to read his newspaper now stared out the window, his face tense and his mind likely racing as he tried to figure out how he could avoid getting involved. The passengers were in a delicate position. Nobody wanted to escalate the situation, but no one could ignore what was happening. The lines were being drawn, and they were being drawn right in front of them. Snoop, however, wasn't flustered. His calm demeanor remained unshaken, even in the face of Henderson's aggressive tone. He took a step forward, his posture straightening, his resolve hardening. "I've paid my fare," he said, his voice clear and steady, cutting through Henderson's rising fury. "I'll sit where I please." It was a simple statement, yet it carried the weight of someone who knew their worth, who understood their rights and wasn't afraid to defend them. He wasn't going to be intimidated by a bus driver with a chip on his shoulder. Henderson's face turned an even deeper shade of red. His fists clenched at his sides, his frustration growing as he realized that Snoop wasn't going to back down. His face twisted with a mix of anger and disbelief. The power he believed he wielded was slipping through his fingers, and in that moment, he had no idea how to regain control of the situation. Without warning, Henderson slammed on the brakes, sending the bus lurching forward in a violent jolt. Passengers were thrown forward, struggling to catch their balance as the bus came to a sudden stop. The abrupt motion caused several passengers to grab at nearby poles or lean on their seats to steady themselves. The startled gasps of passengers filled the air as the bus came to a halt. It wasn't just the force of the stop that shocked everyone, it was the sheer force of Henderson's frustration. Snoop, despite being jolted forward, didn't lose his composure. He remained steady, gripping the pole near him to steady himself, his gaze never wavering from Henderson's. He hadn't moved from his position. He wasn't going to let the driver's tantrum force him to do so. The tension in the bus was now palpable, thick enough to cut through. Whispers grew louder as the other passengers began to murmur amongst themselves. Some were unsure what to do, others were clearly uncomfortable. But all of them were watching, waiting, and beginning to realize that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a confrontation that could have far-reaching implications. The murmurs continued to rise, and a young man sitting near the middle of the bus pulled out his phone, the faint red glow of the camera light visible as he began recording the confrontation. The world, it seemed, was beginning to take notice. The young man's actions only heightened the tension on the bus. Some passengers turned their heads to glance at him, wondering what he was thinking, while others exchanged silent, knowing glances. This wasn't just about a bus ride anymore, it was about something much bigger. Henderson, noticing the young man recording, whipped his gaze toward him, his voice cutting through the already tense atmosphere. "Stay out of it," he snapped, his tone icy. "This isn't your concern." But the young man wasn't intimidated. He leaned back in his seat, undeterred by Henderson's glare, and kept filming, his camera capturing the escalating confrontation between Snoop and the bus driver. Snoop, still calm, turned his attention back to Henderson, meeting the driver's glare with unwavering resolve. "You're the one holding us up," he said, his voice steady but firm. "He's just trying to sit." The words hung in the air, serving as a simple but powerful reminder that the only one causing a disruption was Henderson, not Snoop. Henderson, furious and embarrassed by the young man's defiance, stomped back to his seat, grabbed the radio, and called for transit security. His voice crackled through the speaker as he made his complaint. "Dispatch, this is Route 23. I have a passenger refusing to comply, requesting transit security at my location." The words were clipped and full of frustration, as though he hoped his authority as a bus driver would somehow be reaffirmed by the arrival of security officers. The passengers shifted uncomfortably, their whispers growing louder. The atmosphere inside the bus was increasingly charged. "He's not doing anything wrong," a woman muttered from the back of the bus, her voice barely audible but filled with quiet support for Snoop. "Why is he making such a fuss?" The woman's words seemed to cut through the tension, but they went largely unnoticed by Henderson, whose focus remained locked on Snoop. Snoop, ever the symbol of composure, turned toward the other passengers. He wasn't speaking just to Henderson anymore. He was speaking to everyone. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice carrying across the bus. "It's about what's right." The simple statement hung in the air like a challenge, a call to action. It was clear that Snoop wasn't just standing up for himself. He was standing up for everyone who had ever been wronged, for everyone who had ever felt the sting of injustice. But Henderson was beyond reason now. He wasn't listening to the voices of reason, nor was he willing to compromise. "Spare us the speech," he barked, his patience completely gone. "You're off this bus the second security gets here." Outside, the crowd continued to grow. The murmurs and whispers were now replaced by louder voices, some of which were clearly beginning to pick up on the commotion. The low hum of the bus's engine continued, but the entire atmosphere seemed to vibrate with the energy of the situation. The outside world was beginning to take notice of the drama unfolding inside. Snoop, unfazed, stood firm, his calm presence cutting through the chaos like a beacon of steady resolve. The passengers, once unsure and hesitant, were now fully aware of the gravity of the situation. The conflict wasn't just between Snoop and the driver, it had become a test of morality, of standing up for what was right, no matter the personal cost. The growing tension and public reaction. As the standoff inside the bus continued, the energy outside began to shift as well. The situation that had started as an ordinary, though tense, bus ride was now something much bigger, something that had begun to capture the attention of the public. The passengers, once quiet and hesitant, were now growing more vocal, caught in a storm of emotions that was growing louder with each passing moment. Some of them had initially turned a blind eye to the conflict, not wanting to get involved in what seemed like a personal disagreement. But now, the atmosphere on the bus was one of undeniable tension. What was happening wasn't just an argument between a bus driver and a celebrity. It had become a battle for dignity, for fairness, and for the basic human right to be treated equally. Snoop Dogg, as calm as ever, had become the focal point of this tension. His refusal to move from his seat was no longer just a matter of sitting in the front of the bus. It was a symbolic stand against an unfair and unjust system. His composure, his unyielding presence in the face of Henderson's escalating aggression, was a testament to the power of defiance in the face of oppression. It was a lesson in standing up for what was right, no matter how intimidating or uncomfortable the situation might be. Henderson, on the other hand, was unraveling. His face was twisted in a mask of anger and disbelief, his eyes darting from Snoop to the passengers and back again. His frustration was palpable. The power he believed he held as a bus driver was slipping away with every passing second. Henderson had assumed that his position, his authority as the one behind the wheel of the bus, would be enough to silence Snoop, to bend him to his will. But Snoop wasn't just any passenger, and this wasn't just any bus ride. The encounter had become a moment in history, and Henderson, for all his bravado, was losing control of it. As the silence stretched, it was broken by the faint glow of a phone camera being raised. A young man in the middle row, unable to ignore the drama unfolding before him, had begun recording the confrontation. His phone screen lit up as he captured the growing tension inside the bus, the camera panning across the passengers who were now watching the scene unfold. Henderson's escalating rage, Snoop's quiet defiance, and the nervous energy of the passengers were now being documented. The young man wasn't just recording a fight between two individuals. He was documenting a moment of resistance, a moment that would be shared far beyond the confines of the bus. Snoop, ever aware of the impact of his actions, glanced over at the young man, but didn't break his gaze from the driver. His words remained clear and firm. "You're the one holding us up," he said again, his voice steady and powerful. "He's just trying to sit." The simplicity of his words, the directness with which he addressed the situation, only added to the tension. The message was unmistakable. Snoop was not in the wrong. He wasn't the one causing a disturbance. It was Henderson's refusal to follow the rules, his personal prejudices, and his attempts to assert dominance that were causing the disruption. As Snoop's words echoed through the bus, the tension grew even thicker. The other passengers, who had remained silent up until now, were beginning to show signs of solidarity. A woman near the back of the bus muttered under her breath, "He's not doing anything wrong. Why is he making such a fuss?" Her words, soft but meaningful, seemed to break the dam that had held back any vocal resistance. They weren't loud enough for Henderson to hear, but they resonated with those who were quietly watching. The murmurs of support for Snoop began to spread. Henderson, however, was beyond reason. His authority had been challenged, and he wasn't going to back down. His next move was to escalate the situation even further. Without another word, he stomped back to his seat, seething with anger, and grabbed the radio. His voice crackled through the speaker, demanding that transit security come to his aid. "Dispatch, this is Route 23, he snapped, his voice tight with frustration. "I have a passenger refusing to comply. Requesting transit security at my location." His call for security was an attempt to restore his perceived control over the situation. But what he failed to realize was that by calling for security, he was only drawing more attention to the injustice that was happening on the bus. Outside the bus, the crowd had grown. People were gathering around the vehicle, curious about the commotion inside. Some passengers who had disembarked earlier stood nearby, whispering among themselves. The noise from the growing crowd began to seep into the bus. The distant sound of car horns, the chatter of pedestrians, and the occasional shout filled the air, adding to the already charged atmosphere. The crowd, now aware that something wasn't right, began to murmur in support of Snoop, although none of them had a clear view of what was happening inside the bus. The energy outside mirrored what was happening inside, the sense that something larger was at play. Inside, the murmurs of the passengers grew louder as well. The young man with the phone continued to record, and as the screen of his phone captured every moment, the growing support for Snoop became more visible. Henderson's power was eroding, and the passengers, once passive and uncertain, were now beginning to take sides. A teenage girl, sitting a few rows ahead of Snoop, whispered loudly enough for the others to hear, "This is ridiculous." The words were simple, but they struck a chord. It wasn't just ridiculous, it was wrong. The more the passengers saw, the more they understood that this wasn't just about a seat, it was about something much bigger. The tension continued to build. Some passengers shifted in their seats, no longer content to remain silent. Others whispered among themselves, their voices tinged with frustration and confusion. As the argument between Snoop and Henderson escalated, it became clear that the passengers weren't merely witnesses to a small squabble. They were witnessing something larger, a clash between authority and fairness, between prejudice and equality. And with every passing moment, the tide seemed to shift in Snoop's favor. Outside the bus, the chants began. It started as a quiet murmur, but it quickly grew louder. "Let him sit! Let him sit!" The crowd outside had begun to voice their support for Snoop, their voices carrying across the street, reverberating off the buildings around them. It was as if the very air outside the bus had changed. Now, it was filled with the voices of people demanding justice. The chant began to echo through the streets, a rhythmic, unified cry for equality and fairness. Inside, the passengers began to sense that the tide was turning. Henderson, still seething with anger, could no longer ignore the growing discontent among the passengers. The crowd outside was watching, recording, and chanting. The balance of power had shifted. What was once a small, isolated confrontation on a city bus had become a spectacle, a moment of defiance that resonated far beyond the confines of the bus itself. As the chant outside grew louder, Snoop remained composed, standing firm in the face of Henderson's escalating anger. He wasn't just standing up for himself anymore. He was standing up for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, for everyone who had ever been silenced by authority. The battle that had started over a simple seat on a bus had become something much more significant, a moment that would be remembered, shared, and discussed for years to come. The arrival of transit security. The situation inside the bus had reached a boiling point. Tension was thick in the air, and the crowd outside, now gathered in larger numbers, only amplified the already palpable unease. Snoop Dogg, standing tall and resolute, remained unfazed, his presence as unwavering as ever. He had turned this small moment, a seemingly insignificant altercation, into a powerful statement against injustice. It was no longer just about a seat on the bus, it was about the very concept of authority, prejudice, and standing up for what was right. The murmur of the passengers had grown into more direct comments, some in support of Snoop, some voicing their discomfort with Henderson's increasingly irrational demands. The young man with the phone, still recording every second, now had his camera trained on the door, which was still open, allowing the noise of the crowd outside to filter in. The chanting from the street, "Let him sit! Let him sit!" reverberated through the bus, growing louder by the minute. It was a unified cry for justice, a reminder that the people outside the bus were watching, listening, and ready to support the man standing up for what was right. Inside, the tension continued to rise. Henderson, now flustered and panicking, seemed to grasp at any shred of control he could find. His face was flushed with rage as he fumbled for the radio. The passengers were beginning to realize that the situation wasn't going to end quietly, no matter what they did. The more they watched, the more they saw that Henderson wasn't simply doing his job. He was using his position to impose his personal biases, to try to push around a paying customer simply because of his race and fame. It was something the passengers were beginning to understand, and they could feel the weight of the injustice in the air. Without further delay, Henderson grabbed the radio and barked into it, his voice crackling through the static. "Dispatch, this is Route 23. I have a passenger refusing to comply," he said, his words clipped and full of frustration. "Requesting transit security at my location." It was clear that he believed this call would resolve the situation, that security would show up, back him up, and restore his control over the bus. But what Henderson failed to realize was that his actions were only deepening the divide, making the situation far worse than it had to be. As he finished his transmission, he stood up, his eyes still locked on Snoop. It was as if he was trying to will Snoop into submission, his glare burning with intensity. Snoop, on the other hand, remained calm and composed, unfazed by the driver's ire. His voice remained steady, his posture unyielding. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity now. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, ignored, or oppressed. It was a quiet but powerful form of resistance, one that had already begun to make its mark on the passengers. The arrival of the transit security officers was now imminent, and the bus was becoming a pressure cooker. Every second that passed brought the situation closer to a breaking point. The sirens, distant at first, began to grow louder, and the hum of the engine seemed to slow down in response to the heightened tension. The doors of the bus remained open, and as the sound of the sirens grew, the noise from the crowd outside grew even louder. People had gathered, their voices joining the chants in support of Snoop, their solidarity clear. It was only a matter of minutes before the officers arrived. The faint sound of their footsteps outside could be heard, growing louder as they approached the bus. Inside, every passenger was now fully aware that this was no longer just a bus ride, it was a public spectacle. The eyes of the world were now on them, and whether they wanted to or not, they were all part of something much bigger than themselves. As the doors of the bus hissed open, 2 transit security officers stepped onto the vehicle. Their uniforms were dark and imposing, contrasting sharply with the warm morning sunlight filtering through the windows. Their faces were neutral, but there was no mistaking the tension that hung in the air. One officer, a tall man with a shaved head, immediately turned his attention to Snoop, his eyes scanning him with a professional detachment. The second officer, a woman with short hair, stood slightly behind him, her arms crossed in front of her as she took in the scene. The first officer spoke, his voice even and measured. "Sir," he began, addressing Snoop, "we've been called because you're refusing to follow the driver's instructions. Can you tell us what's going on?" The officer's tone was polite but firm, the kind that suggested they were trying to de-escalate the situation. He wasn't there to take sides yet, but it was clear that he expected Snoop to comply, to back down, to make the situation easier for everyone. Snoop, his posture never faltering, turned to face the officer, his voice calm but unwavering. "I paid my fare, like everyone else," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "And I'm being told to move to the back of the bus for no reason other than his prejudice. That's not right." His words were simple but powerful, a declaration of his rights and a quiet challenge to the unfairness he was facing. He wasn't backing down, not now, not ever. The officer seemed taken aback, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but he quickly recovered. "Well, sir," the officer continued, "the easiest thing would be to move to another seat. We're just trying to resolve this without further delay." There was a hint of impatience creeping into his voice now, as if he were tired of trying to mediate between the two parties. But Snoop, ever the symbol of unyielding calm, responded once more. "I'm not the one delaying the bus," he said firmly. "He is. If I move now, he'll think he can keep treating people like this. And I'm not going to let that happen." The officer's face tightened, and he glanced at his partner, clearly weighing his next words. Outside, the crowd had begun to gather in even larger numbers, their chants now clear through the open doors of the bus. The scene was growing bigger by the minute, and the officers could feel the pressure mounting. They were tasked with resolving the situation, but they were quickly realizing that this wasn't just about a seat on a bus anymore. It was about something much more significant, something that had captured the attention of the city, if not the world. Just as the officers began to deliberate, the young man with the phone, still recording, leaned forward and addressed the officer. "Everyone's already seen what's happening, man," he said, his voice steady but full of resolve. "This video is going to be everywhere by tonight." His words were like a spark in dry tinder, and the air in the bus seemed to grow even heavier. The officers exchanged an uncomfortable glance, and the murmurs among the passengers grew louder. It was clear that the public was watching, and Snoop was no longer just a passenger. He had become a symbol of resistance, a beacon for those who were tired of injustice. The officer, sensing the growing pressure, tried again to calm things down. "Sir, we just want to resolve this," he said, his voice softer now. "But you need to move so we can move on with the bus ride. Everyone's waiting." Snoop didn't budge. "I'm not moving," he said, his voice unwavering. "I've done nothing wrong, and I'm not going to let this man make a mockery of justice. Not today." As the officers stood there, uncertain how to proceed, the energy outside continued to build. The crowd's chants grew louder and more forceful, now more organized than before. The eyes of the world were now on the bus, and everyone was watching, waiting to see how this would end. The officers were caught in the middle, their authority being tested in ways they had not expected. The climax and Henderson's arrest. The tension on the bus was now so thick it felt as though it could be sliced with a knife. Every second stretched on endlessly as Snoop Dogg remained steadfast, refusing to move from his seat near the front of the bus. Henderson, standing near the front of the bus, fumed with frustration and rage. His grip on the situation had slipped beyond his control, and he knew it. His anger was now consuming him, his hands trembling with the effort to contain his fury. The officers' attempts to de-escalate the situation had failed, and it was clear that neither party was willing to back down. Outside the bus, the crowd continued to grow. More people had gathered around, their voices rising in support of Snoop, chanting in unison, "Let him sit! Let him sit!" The sound of their chants reverberated through the air, carrying with it a sense of solidarity and collective defiance. As the crowd outside grew louder, the passengers inside could feel the weight of the moment, the significance of what was unfolding right before their eyes. This wasn't just a bus ride anymore, it had become a confrontation of ideals, a fight for justice, dignity, and equality. Inside the bus, Henderson's frustration had reached its boiling point. His jaw clenched tight, his face flushed a deep red. The officer standing near him tried to maintain control, but it was clear that the situation was quickly spiraling out of hand. Snoop remained seated, his posture erect, his eyes steady and calm. He was a beacon of quiet resolve, a man who knew what was right and refused to allow anyone to push him around. His quiet strength was a contrast to the explosive energy coming from Henderson, who was now pacing in agitation, unable to regain control of the situation. "I've had enough of this," Henderson muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. His face twisted with anger as he stomped toward Snoop, his steps heavy and purposeful. The other passengers tensed, their eyes darting from Snoop to Henderson, unsure of what would happen next. The young man with the phone, who had been recording the entire situation, zoomed in on Henderson, his camera capturing every detail. He had been documenting this moment for the world to see, and he wasn't about to stop now. Snoop didn't flinch. He remained calm and composed, his hands resting lightly on his lap. He knew what was coming, and he wasn't afraid. He had made his stand, and he would continue to stand firm. As Henderson approached, his face twisted with rage, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He loomed over Snoop, blocking out the light from the windows with his imposing figure. The bus was silent now, the only sound being the distant hum of the engine and the chants growing louder from outside. The moment had come to a head. "I told you to get off my bus," Henderson snarled, his voice low and menacing. He leaned over Snoop, trying to intimidate him, but Snoop wasn't intimidated. He didn't raise his voice or stand up. Instead, he looked up at Henderson, his gaze steady and unwavering. "If you lay one finger on me, you'll regret it," Snoop said, his voice low but firm. The warning was clear. Henderson wasn't in control here, and any move he made would be met with resistance. Henderson, however, didn't seem to heed the warning. His frustration reached a peak, and in a sudden violent movement, he grabbed Snoop's arm roughly, yanking him halfway out of his seat. The force of the pull sent Snoop stumbling, but he didn't cry out. He didn't fight back physically, but his eyes locked onto Henderson's with quiet fury. The passengers gasped in shock, several leaping to their feet in protest. "Stop him!" someone shouted, their voice filled with outrage. The young man with the phone immediately rushed forward, continuing to record the incident. "Let him go!" he yelled, his voice filled with urgency. "Don't touch him!" The bus erupted into chaos. Passengers shouted in protest, some standing up, some reaching for their phones to capture what was happening. Snoop, though shaken by the rough handling, did not allow himself to be pushed further. He stood tall, his composure unwavering, even as Henderson continued to try to drag him out of his seat. The young man with the phone pushed forward, angling his camera toward the confrontation. "This is assault," he shouted. "This man is assaulting Snoop Dogg." Henderson, caught up in his anger and desperation, shoved the young man back with his free hand, sending him stumbling into another seat. The young man, however, didn't back down. He stood up and continued filming, determined to document the truth for the world to see. "You're making a huge mistake," he warned. "This is going viral." His words were more than just a warning to Henderson, they were a statement of fact. The video of this moment was going to be shared with thousands, maybe millions. The world would see what was happening, and it wouldn't be easy for anyone to ignore. The struggle between Henderson and Snoop continued for a few tense moments, until the doors of the bus suddenly flew open with a loud hiss. Two transit security officers charged onto the bus, their uniforms standing out against the sunlight streaming through the windows. The officers immediately took in the scene, Henderson gripping Snoop's arm, the passengers in a state of shock, and the young man still filming. One officer barked, his voice commanding, "Stop right now." His tone was firm and filled with authority, and the other officer moved quickly to assess the situation. "Driver, let him go," the officer ordered, stepping forward. "You need to release him right now." Henderson froze, his hand still gripping Snoop's arm, but the presence of the officers was enough to make him hesitate. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. The passengers, who had been watching in stunned silence, now held their collective breath. The air was thick with the tension of the moment, as if everyone knew this was the turning point. "If you don't let him go this second," the officer continued, "you're going to be arrested for assault." The words were stern, and there was no mistaking the seriousness behind them. The officer's hand hovered near his belt, where his handcuffs were visible, and the message was clear. Henderson's time of dominance had come to an end. Henderson, his face flushed with humiliation and anger, hesitated for a moment longer. The tension hung in the air like a live wire. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he released Snoop's arm. The officer immediately stepped between them, guiding Henderson back toward the aisle. But Henderson wasn't done yet. His face twisted with rage as he muttered under his breath. "You'll regret this, man," he growled, glaring at Snoop. "You'll all regret this." His words were drowned out by the chants growing louder outside, but the bitterness in his voice was unmistakable. The officer, having taken control of the situation, grabbed Henderson by the arm and began to escort him down the bus. "Driver, you're under arrest for assault," the officer said, his voice cold and commanding. Henderson's protests were drowned out by the sound of the crowd outside, which had now grown into a full roar. Cameras flashed as reporters and onlookers outside documented the arrest. Henderson struggled against the officer's grip, but it was clear that his power was gone. The once proud bus driver, who had tried to assert his dominance over Snoop, was now being led off the bus in handcuffs. Inside the bus, the passengers erupted into applause. The teenage girl who had spoken out earlier clapped loudly, her grin wide with relief and joy. "Finally, some justice," she exclaimed, her voice full of excitement. The young man with the phone, still recording, smiled, lowering his camera to speak directly to Snoop. "Man, that was incredible," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "Everyone's going to see this. You're a legend." Snoop gave the young man a faint smile, but he said nothing. His composure remained steady, his gaze fixed on the aisle as Henderson was marched off the bus. The passengers, once unsure and silent, now felt a sense of solidarity. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a moment of justice, a stand against the abuse of power, and a powerful display of dignity in the face of adversity. The energy in the bus had shifted from unease and discomfort to something more powerful, something that felt like a victory, even in the midst of chaos. As the officer led Henderson off the bus and into the waiting police car, the chants outside grew louder. "Justice for Snoop! Justice for Snoop!" The crowd support was unwavering, and Snoop, the man at the center of it all, remained calm, his dignity intact. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, the tide seemed to be turning in his favor. As the bus doors closed and the rumble of the engine began once more, the passengers sat in stunned silence, processing what had just transpired. What began as a tense confrontation had transformed into a moment of triumph, a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up for what is right, no matter the cost. Snoop Dogg, the man at the center of it all, remained calm and composed, his dignity unshaken despite the chaos that had unfolded. His quiet defiance had inspired everyone in that bus, from the once silent passengers to the young man who had recorded it all. The tension in the air slowly began to dissipate as the bus continued its route through Compton, but the impact of what had happened lingered in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. Outside the bus, the chants of "Justice for Snoop! Justice for Snoop!" continued to rise, echoing through the streets. The crowd had gathered in full force, their voices unified in support of the rapper who had stood his ground against injustice. The signs they held up, one reading "End the Hate," another simply saying "Let him sit," reminded everyone that this was not just about a single incident on a city bus. It was about standing up to systemic prejudice, to those who wielded power without accountability. Snoop Dogg had become a symbol of resistance, not just for himself but for everyone who had ever been silenced, marginalized, or forced to endure discrimination. Inside the bus, a quiet solidarity had formed among the passengers. They exchanged looks, some of them nodding to each other in quiet recognition of what had just occurred. For many, this wasn't just about a bus ride, it was a lesson in the power of standing up for what's right. The teenage girl who had spoken out against Henderson's treatment of Snoop earlier now leaned forward, her voice soft but filled with admiration. "You're amazing," she said, her eyes wide. "I can't believe you stood up to him like that. It's not easy to do that in front of everyone." Snoop smiled gently at her, his voice calm. "Sometimes you have to take a stand, even if it's uncomfortable," he said. "It's never easy, but it's always worth it." The man in the suit, who had remained mostly silent throughout the ordeal, spoke up now, his voice calm but filled with respect. "You've got more courage than most people, Mr. Dogg," he said, nodding his head slightly. "What you did today wasn't just for you, it was for all of us. That man deserved everything he got." Snoop's gaze softened, and he nodded in acknowledgement, but he didn't respond. He didn't need to. The respect and solidarity were evident in the way the passengers had come together, how they had all borne witness to something far bigger than themselves. The young man with the phone, still recording, now sat next to Snoop, lowering his camera. "That video is already blowing up," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "Tens of thousands of views already. People are sharing it everywhere. This is bigger than just this bus." Snoop raised an eyebrow and smiled slightly. "Well, maybe the truth has a way of getting out," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet satisfaction. "That's the power of standing up." Outside, the crowd's chants had begun to quiet down, but their energy remained palpable. The world had seen what had happened on that bus, and the ripple effects of that moment would continue to be felt. The media had arrived, cameras flashing as they documented the aftermath of the incident. Henderson's arrest was now part of the public record, and his actions would not be easily forgotten. But as the crowd began to disperse, their unity remained. The message had been clear: no one should be allowed to discriminate or abuse their power, and everyone had the right to stand up against it. As the bus rolled forward, making its way through the streets of Compton, the passengers slowly began to relax. The earlier tension had lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of victory. Snoop leaned back in his seat, his shoulders finally relaxing after the intense confrontation. His hand rested on his lap, the tension in his body easing. He had done what needed to be done, and while the journey wasn't over, there was a sense that he had made a difference. A few stops later, the replacement driver, a young woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, took the wheel. She greeted the passengers with a light, respectful tone, but it was clear that there was a sense of reverence for what had transpired on the bus. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice soft but filled with professionalism. "I'll be taking over for the rest of the route. Thank you for your patience today." Snoop nodded at her, acknowledging her presence, but didn't speak. He had already said everything he needed to. The rest of the passengers, however, were more talkative now. Conversations filled the air as people began discussing the events that had just occurred. Some debated the reasons behind Henderson's actions, while others reflected on the larger implications of the incident. A few even questioned how such behavior had been allowed to persist for so long. It was clear that the bus ride would not soon be forgotten. As the bus moved along its route, Snoop continued to listen quietly. His gaze swept across the passengers, and for a moment, he was reminded of the power of unity, of collective action. It wasn't just his defiance that had made a difference, it was the way the people around him had started to take a stand, even in their small ways. Whether it was the teenage girl speaking out, the young man recording the video, or the passengers who had remained silent but had silently supported him, they had all become part of something much bigger. They had witnessed a moment of change, a shift in the way people saw injustice, and they would carry that lesson with them long after the bus ride was over. The young man with the phone spoke up again, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful. "What happens next?" he asked, glancing over at Snoop. "What do we do now?" Snoop looked at him for a long moment before answering. "We keep going," he said simply. "We keep standing up. We keep speaking out. And we make sure that people see what happened today." His voice was steady, filled with a quiet confidence that had carried him through the entire ordeal. "Change doesn't come from silence," he added, his words settling over the bus like a quiet resolution. As the bus continued along its route, The passengers seemed to sit a little straighter, their unease replaced by a sense of resolve. For many of them, this was more than just a bus ride. It was a moment of awakening, a realization that they, too, could be a part of something bigger. And for Snoop Dogg, the journey was far from over. But for the first time, it felt like the tide had begun to turn. The fight for justice, equality, and dignity would continue, but in this small moment, on this bus in Compton, they had witnessed a victory. As the bus pulled up to the next stop, a few passengers disembarked, their heads held high, their steps a little more confident. The crowd outside had thinned, but their chants of support for Snoop Dogg still lingered in the air. And for everyone who had witnessed the confrontation, whether on the bus, in the crowd, or through the viral video that would soon be shared across the world, there was no doubt that the story was far from over. Title: Snoop Dogg Stands Up for Justice, a bus ride that changed everything. Description: In the heart of Compton, a routine bus ride turns into a battleground for justice when a racist bus driver demands that legendary rapper Snoop Dogg sit at the back of the bus. But Snoop refuses to comply, sparking a tense confrontation that draws in the attention of passengers, the crowd outside, and the world. Watch as Snoop stands firm against injustice, showing the power of quiet defiance in the face of authority. This story is a testament to standing up for what's right, no matter the personal cost. With growing support from passengers and the public, Snoop becomes a symbol of resistance, reminding everyone that justice should never be compromised. This unforgettable moment, captured on video, showcases the courage it takes to challenge unfair systems, and the impact it can have when we all stand together. Witness a pivotal moment in the fight for equality and the rights of every individual to be treated with dignity. Loudspeaker: Join the movement for justice. Share this video with your friends and family. Leave a comment below. What would you do in this situation? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of resistance and change.